after losing his son to gang violence. He relentlessly hunts them down. Just when he's on the verge of taking down the gang leader, an unexpected turn of events costs him a lot. The movie opens on December 24th, 2001, with Brian Godlock sprinting through the streets of Las Palmas, Texas. He's wearing a Christmas sweater, but it's soaked in blood. A police siren blares in the distance as Brian finds himself caught in a chaotic shootout, chasing two cars. One car rams the other, causing it to crash. While the other vehicle out of the way, Brian turns his attention to the second car. Grabbing an iron rod from a nearby garbage can, he waits for it to approach. As it does, he smashes the windshield and takes off running. The car gives chase, but a forklift suddenly appears ahead. Brian leaps out of the way, and the forklift slams into the car, killing the driver. Just as Brian thinks he's in control, Playa, the passenger, steps out and shoots him in the throat. Brian is rushed to the hospital, where surgeons desperately work to save him, while Christmas music plays softly in the background. His wife, Saya, arrives at the hospital, also covered in blood. As Brian remains unconscious, Detective Dennis Vassell visits him. The detective checks if Brian is awake, but he isn't. Turning around, Dennis notices Saya asleep in a chair nearby. Over the next few days, Saya helps care for Brian, though he is now unable to speak. Determined to regain some mobility, he starts moving around the hospital to strengthen his muscles. He tries using a voice assist machine, but upon hearing the robotic sound it produces, he angrily throws it aside. After a month, Brian is discharged. He and Saya get into the car, and she begins the drive home. As they pass by scenes of gang violence, Brian grows increasingly furious. In a fit of frustration, he rips off his cross necklace, sensing his turmoil. When they arrive home, Brian has a flashback of his son playing in the yard, making him emotional. Inside, he sees the Christmas tree and breaks down, crying uncontrollably. Saya tries to calm him with a hug, but he soon gets up and starts throwing things in anger. He stumbles across a newspaper with a headline reporting the tragic death of Taylor, a young victim of a stray bullet in a gang-related shooting. Overcome with anxiety, Brian tears up the newspaper and heads to the fridge. Consumed by grief, Brian turns to alcohol. Saya, watching his downward spiral, begins to cry, but he ignores her and heads to the garage. The next morning, as Saya gets ready, she finds Brian still drinking. She tries to reach out, texting him in an effort to reconnect, but Brian coldly ignores her. Memories of their son, Taylor, flood his mind. Brian goes to Taylor's room and collapses on his bed, crying. The events of that fateful Christmas Eve resurface. Brian had been playing outside with Taylor while Saya recorded them on video. Suddenly, two cars involved in a shootout sped into their neighborhood. Brian tried to shield Taylor, but it was too late. Taylor had already been struck by a stray bullet. After the flashback, Brian returns to the garage and pours out the alcohol. He takes out Taylor's old bike and sets it on the table. Meanwhile, Saya comes home from work and starts looking for him. She heads to Taylor's room and finds it trashed. She texts Brian again, but he continues to ignore her, even as she watches him from behind. Later, Brian visits Detective Vassell's office. He sees a wall covered with photos of criminals and snaps pictures of several gang members. Then, he notices Playa's photo. A flashback of Playa shooting him comes to mind, and Brian leaves before meeting with the detective. When Detective Vassell returns to his office, he catches a glimpse of Brian entering the elevator. Back at home, Brian creates a board, mapping out his targets and circling Christmas Eve on his calendar. In the following months, Brian dedicates himself to intense physical and mental training, honing his skills in combat, weapons, and driving in preparation for his revenge. He practically lives in the garage, and the distance between him and Seiya grows even wider. Brian buys a car and starts modifying it to improve his performance. As Seiya works in the living room, she hears him tinkering in the garage and begins to cry, feeling the growing emotional distance between them. Meanwhile, Brian takes up shooting practice, preparing for what lies ahead. One night, Seiya is lying on the couch with Brian, asleep in his arms. She suddenly wakes up crying, overwhelmed by the situation. Without a word, she grabs her luggage and purse and leaves. Brian watches as she loads her things into the car, but instead of stopping her, he returns to the house and vents his frustration by aggressively beating his training dummy. After completing work on his car, Brian takes it out for a test drive, pushing it to its limits. He begins spying on the gang's headquarters, discreetly taking photos of their illegal activities, cash and weapons being exchanged, and even playa with his girlfriend, Venus. Once back home, he resumes his routine of training and working out, mastering control over his modified car. This becomes his daily life for a while. One day, as Brian is entering a store, he spots a young boy walking out. Overcome with emotion, he hugs the child, but the boy's mother, startled by the interaction, quickly pulls her son away. While at a hardware store, Brian crosses paths with Playa and some of his gang members as they hand out money to local kids. Fueled by anger, Brian instinctively reaches for a knife, but restrains himself. However, Venus spots him and signals one of the men to shove him to the ground. After knocking him down, Venus mockingly dumps her ice cream on his face while laughing at his humiliation. On December 23rd, Brian decides it's time to take action. He breaks into the home of Playa's money handler, Anthony, and ambushes him. After delivering a brutal punch, Brian knocking Anthony down. Brian drags him back to his garage and ties him up. Brian immediately begins beating him. As Anthony's eyes dart around the room, he notices the wall plastered with incriminating photos and evidence. Brian then shoves a stack of papers in front of him, filled with a list of crimes, demanding that Anthony reveal critical information about Playa's operations. However, Anthony seizes a moment to retaliate, using a knife to cut the ropes binding his hands. A fierce struggle ensues, and they crash out of the basement into the living room, where the fight escalates into a brutal brawl throughout the house. Despite being stabbed twice by Anthony, Brian ultimately overpowers him, knocking him out once again. After the fight, Brian prepares for his final showdown. He dons a bulletproof vest and arms himself with a variety of guns and equipment. Once ready, he takes a moment to sit down and write a letter. He then heads to Taylor's room and, filled with emotion, plays with his son's toys. On Christmas Eve, Brian drives past Seiya's house, watching her happily creating artwork in memory of Taylor. Overcome with emotion, Brian visits Taylor's grave, leaving a wrapped train set as a gift. Meanwhile, Detective Vassal hears a mysterious knock at his door. When he opens it, he finds Anthony bound and gagged, with a Christmas card attached. Shortly after, the police arrive and arrest Anthony. Back inside, Detective Vassal examines the card and finds a USB drive tucked inside. Plugging it in, he discovers that it contains all of Brian's research on Playa's gang, including Anthony's confessions. A note attached to the card reads, "What you should have done. It ends tonight." Brian begins his hunt, targeting Playa's men. His first victims are two gang members outside a bar, caught in the act of robbing and beating a woman. After they take her money and leave, Brian rams his car into them, pitting them against a wall. He stabs one of them in the stomach, while the other jumps onto the roof of his car. Brian keeps driving and shoots the man dead while he clings to the vehicle. The violence makes Brian feel sick, but he doesn't let it stop him. Later, a shootout erupts nearby between rival gangs and the police. Brian drives into the chaos, taking out several gang members. As the violence unfolds, one of the gangs begins recording the mayhem. sends the footage of Brian's car to Playa. In revenge, Brian kills the man and sends his own video back to Playa, showing the murder as a warning. While Brian is driving, a car approaches from behind, and, sensing danger, he speeds up, leading to a high-speed chase and an intense shootout with Ruiz's crew. Brian manages to kill all of Ruiz's men in the process, leaving Ruiz seriously wounded. Later, Brian sits by a fire, contemplating his next move. He takes out the phone of one of the gang members he killed and sees a group text from Playa, summoning all his men, including Ruiz. Brian switches to a motorcycle and heads straight for Playa's compound. Upon arrival, Brian slides his bike through the garage, firing shots as a heavy firefight breaks out. After taking down several men, he shoots the gas tank of his bike, causing an explosion that wipes out the remaining guards. Inside, Playa is indulging in drugs and dancing with Venus in his penthouse, oblivious to the chaos Brian is unleashing below. As he approaches Playa's room, he sets up traps outside to ensure no reinforcements can reach them. As Brian fights his way up, Ruiz ambushes him once again. A vicious battle ensues, but just as more gang members arrive, they trigger one of Brian's traps, causing a massive explosion. Meanwhile, Detective Vassal arrives at the scene, taking down several of Playa's men. Vassal continues clearing the compound until he finds Brian, now severely injured. He points his gun at Brian, but after a silent exchange of understanding, Vassal lowers his weapon, deciding to let Brian go. Just as they share this moment, Venus bursts in with a machine gun, opening fire on both men. When she runs out of bullets, Brian hesitates to kill her. Sensing his hesitation, Venus grabs another weapon and shoots him in the chest. Before Brian can react, she turns and shoots Vassal twice in the stomach. Acting quickly, Brian fires back, killing her instantly. Though severely wounded, Brian pushes forward into Playa's penthouse for the final showdown. A brutal gunfight erupts between the two, with Playa landing several shots on Brian's vest and knocking him to the ground. Just as Playa is about to deliver the final blow, Vassal reappears, shooting Playa and giving Brian a chance to recover. Seizing the moment, Brian tackles Playa and repeatedly punches him. The fight ends when Brian strangles Playa to death with his bare hands. Exhausted and bleeding heavily, both Brian and Vassal collapse on the floor, lying side by side. As Brian drifts in and out of consciousness, he sees flashes of Taylor's life, imagining the future his son could have had. Later, Saya sits by Taylor's grave, reading a note left behind by Brian. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.